Chapter 1. The Ghost of the House of Vane. The train groaned like an old beast straining against its own weight, iron wheels shrieking as it cut through the grey French countryside toward the coast. Steam curled past the windows in pale, shifting ghosts, blurring the hedgerows and winter-bare trees into streaks of charcoal and ash. Inside the third-class carriage, the air was a thick soup of coal smoke, damp wool, and the faint, bitter scent of the oranges Marie had insisted on buying in Paris. Marie hated trains. She had hated them since she was a child standing on a rain-slicked platform, watching the only world she knew pull away into a tunnel of smoke. She had learned early that all departures came with promises that were never kept, and all arrivals were merely a precursor to a new kind of struggle. Across from her, Louise sat with her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her spine straight despite the narrow wooden bench and the rhythmic jolting that threatened to bruise the bone. She was rereading the letter again. Marie had counted. This was the fourth time since they had pulled out of the Gare du Nord. The paper, expensive and heavy, trembled slightly between Louise's fingers. The Vane family crest, a falcon with its talons spread, seemed to glare at Marie from the wax seal. "You will wear a hole through it," Marie said, her voice cutting through the mechanical rumble. Her accent was soft but unmistakably French, the vowels rounded by the streets of Paris. "Then what will you do? Ask the conductor for another copy?" Louise smiled faintly, her blue-grey eyes never leaving the page. "I just want to be sure I have not misunderstood something. The legal phrasing is complex." Marie snorted quietly, a sharp, dismissive sound. She leaned forward, the flickering lamp overhead casting long shadows across her face. "It is not complex, chérie. It is obvious. They want your money. They have looked into their coffers, found only dust and spiders, and remembered they have a niece who is suddenly smelling of American gold." "That is not fair," Louise said, though the protest lacked conviction. "They want me." Marie leaned back, arms crossed over her threadbare cloak. "Ils te veulent maintenant parce que tu es utile. They want you now because you are a tool. Before this letter arrived, you did not exist to them. You were a ghost they had buried in a French boarding school 15 years ago." Louise finally looked up, her expression troubled. "They are my family, Marie, my father's blood." "So was my mother, the woman who abandoned me on a church porch," Marie replied, her voice cold. "And now she is dead, and I am here. Family is a word people use when they want to put a leash on you. It does not mean kindness." Louise folded the letter carefully, smoothing the creases with a reverent touch before slipping it back into her reticule. It was as if she were tucking away a fragile hope, a dream of belonging that she had carried since she was 6 years old. Outside, the land rolled on, indifferent to the girl who clutched at a ghost. The letter had arrived a week ago, delivered to their small, slanted apartment near the Seine. Marie remembered the boy who brought it. He had smelled of ink and damp wool, a messenger of fate in a dirty cap. Louise had stood in the doorway, holding it, staring at the English seal as if it might bite her. "Your presence is requested immediately," it had said, polite, cold, formal, like a summons to a courtroom rather than a homecoming. Her uncle Etienne in America, a man Louise had met only once, a merchant who had spent his life building a kingdom of timber and rail, was dead. He had no children of his own. He had left her everything. The fortune was rumoured to be vast enough to buy half of London. And the Vane family, a viscount's house living in the decaying splendour of a title they could no longer afford, had suddenly developed a very long memory. The train lurched violently, and Louise's shoulder brushed Marie's knee. "Pardon," Louise murmured automatically. Marie softened, the iron in her expression melting just a fraction. She reached out and squeezed Louise's hand. The skin of Louise's palm was soft, untouched by the hard labour that had calloused Marie's own. "You do not need to apologize for existing, ma sœur." Louise's eyes shimmered. "You are the only person who has ever called me that." "You have been my sister since we were 6, Marie said, her voice firm. "Whether the House of Vane likes it or not. When the school forgot to feed us, we shared a crust. When the winter was too cold, we shared a blanket. That is blood, not a name on a piece of parchment." They had been inseparable since the boarding school outside Lyon. Louise had arrived with a single trunk and eyes swollen from crying for a mother who was gone, and a father who did not know what to do with a half-French daughter. Marie had arrived with nothing but a fierce glare and a refusal to be broken. By 16, they were a unit. When Louise's letters to England went unanswered, Marie was the one who held her while she sobbed. When Marie aged out of the school with no family to claim her, Louise had staged a quiet rebellion, refusing to leave until Marie was hired as a companion. Then came Paris. Freedom was a beautiful, starving thing. They had worked at a respectable hotel near the river, Louise with her innate grace at the reception, Marie quick-witted and sharp, managing the books and translating for the English travellers she so despised. They had been happy in their poverty. They had been safe. Until England reached out its hand. "You are staring again," Marie noted, watching Louise gaze at the passing fog. Louise flushed. "I cannot help it. I keep thinking. What if they have changed? What if the Viscount truly regrets the distance?" Marie laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that was swallowed by the roar of the engine. "At their age, people do not change, Louise. They only become more of what they already are. If they were greedy enough to dump a child in a foreign land to save their reputation, they are greedy enough to lie to her now." "They were not unkind when I was very small," Louise said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "I remember a garden. I remember my mother's voice." Marie did not answer. She remembered Louise at 6 years old, standing rigid in the school courtyard, her small hand clutching a teddy bear with a missing eye, while a carriage drove away without so much as a backward glance from the man inside. That was the Vane family. That was England. The train whistle screamed, a long, piercing wail that echoed across the flat plains as they neared the coast. Louise startled, her hand flying to her throat. "Promise me something," Marie said suddenly, her tone turning grave. Louise turned to her. "What?" "That you will not let them bully you. The moment you step into that house, they will try to make you feel small. They will mock your French manners and your accent. They will treat you like a guest in your own life." Louise hesitated, her gaze drifting to her worn gloves. "They are very grand, Marie. A viscount. A manor in London." "So are storms," Marie said, leaning forward. "And they can still be endured. You are the one with the fortune, Louise. You hold the keys. Do not let them make you forget that. I hate bullies, and I will not watch them break you." Louise laughed softly, a sound like silver bells. "You always speak as if you are ready to go to war." "I am," Marie said simply. A heavy silence fell between them, filled only by the rhythmic clack-clack of the rails. The carriage smelled of coal dust and the encroaching damp of the sea. Marie watched the other passengers, a man clutching a pocket watch, a woman calculating the cost of her neighbour's shawl. Everyone was hungry for something. England would be worse, Marie knew. England would smell the American gold on Louise like blood in the water. The train slowed suddenly, jerking hard enough to rattle their teeth. The luggage in the overhead racks shifted ominously. Louise grabbed Marie's sleeve. "What is happening? We are not at the coast yet." Marie frowned, standing up to peer out the window into the thickening fog. "I do not know. The signal is—" There was a sound then, a wrong, terrible sound, a screech of metal against metal that felt like it was tearing the world in two. The floor beneath them buckled. The carriage lurched violently to the left, throwing Marie against the wall. Someone in the next compartment screamed, a high, thin sound that was cut short. "Louise!" Marie shouted, lunging through the tilting space, her fingers scratching for her friend's hand. The world exploded into white light and shattering glass. Noise, heat, and the smell of tearing iron. Marie felt a sickening sensation of weightlessness, and then a crushing, bone-deep force. Wood splintered like dry kindling. The world spun. Pain bloomed white-hot along her side, a jagged fire that stole her breath. She heard Louise cry out once, a sharp, frightened gasp of her name, and then the sound was swallowed by the roar of the wreck. Smoke filled Marie's lungs. She coughed, the movement sending waves of agony through her ribs. She was pinned under something heavy, a piece of the carriage wall. She reached blindly through the darkness, through the dust and the smell of burning oil. Her fingers closed on fabric, a silk sleeve, but it was limp, and it slipped away as the wreckage shifted. "Louise!" she screamed, but her voice was a raw, broken thing. Somewhere nearby, the fire crackled. Voices began to rise from the wreckage, moans, prayers, and the frantic shouting of rescuers. But in Marie's immediate circle, there was only a terrifying, heavy silence. Pain dragged her down into the dark. When she woke, the sky was gone. The ceiling above her was low, made of rough, age-darkened beams. A small infirmary. Her head throbbed with the beat of a drum, and every breath felt like a needle in her lung. A woman in a plain apron noticed her stirring and hurried over. "Stay still, dear. You've had a terrible shock. A miracle you're alive, the doctor says. So much worse for the others." "Louise," Marie rasped, the word tearing at her throat. "Where is my friend? Louise Vane?" The woman's face shifted, pity settling over her features like a shroud. She did not speak. She only shook her head slowly. Marie closed her eyes. She did not cry. She felt a great yawning hollow open up inside her, a void where her heart used to be. The house of Vane had wanted Louise, and the journey had claimed her before they could. On the third day, footsteps sounded in the corridor, brisk, arrogant, and rhythmic. A man's voice, cold and impersonal, drifted through the door. "I am here for the survivor, Miss Louise Vane." Marie's eyes snapped open. A servant entered. He was dressed in the stiff, expensive livery of a great house, his posture rigid with a misplaced sense of propriety. He looked at the modest, peeling walls of the sick room with clear disapproval, his nose wrinkled as if the air itself were beneath him. He did not look like a man in mourning. He looked like a man picking up a misplaced trunk. Marie pushed herself upright, the pain in her side a screaming reminder of the fire and the iron. She looked at the servant, at the lack of grief in his eyes, the absence of a single family member. Not a cousin, not an uncle, just a hired man to collect a check. The fury that had been simmering in her since she was 6 years old suddenly boiled over, turning into something cold, hard, and sharp as a diamond. "I am Louise," she said. The lie tasted like blood and ash, but it felt right. Her own identity was nothing, a penniless orphan, but Louise's identity was a weapon. The servant inclined his head slightly, his gaze scanning her bruised face. He saw the resemblance, the dark hair, the age, the French lilt they expected. He saw what he wanted to see. "We have been sent from the Viscount's household to collect you, miss. The carriage is waiting." Marie stared at him, her jaw set. "A servant? My uncle did not come himself? My cousins?" "They are indisposed," the man replied smoothly, though his eyes shifted. Indisposed. Louise had died for this family's summons, and they could not even bother to leave their drawing rooms to identify her body. Marie smiled then. It was not a smile of joy, but the slow, dangerous baring of teeth. She reached into the folds of her borrowed shift and felt the cold silver of the locket she had pulled from the wreckage, the keepsake. "Très bien," Marie said, her voice dropping into a low, commanding tone. "Take me home." As the servant turned to make the arrangements, Marie looked out the window at the grey English rain. She whispered into the silence, in the language of her childhood and her rage. "For you, ma sœur, I will be the whip they deserve." Chapter 2. The House of Vultures. London was not a city. It was a throat, choking on coal smoke and the cold, damp breath of the Thames. Marie sat rigidly in the Vane carriage, her fingers buried deep into the velvet upholstery. Every time the wheels hit a cobble, pain flared in her ribs, a jagged reminder of the iron and fire she had left behind in the French countryside. Outside the window, the fog was a yellow, sulphurous soup, swallowing the grand stone edifices of Mayfair. When the carriage finally lurched to a halt, she looked up at the Vane ancestral home. It was a monstrous pile of soot-stained limestone, opulent in its scale but weeping with neglect. Peeling paint clung to the window frames like dead skin, and the iron railings were choked with rust. "We are here, miss," the servant Mr. Barnes said as he opened the door. He didn't offer his hand. He merely stood there, his face a mask of bored professional disdain. Marie stepped out, her chin tilted high. She wore a borrowed black dress that smelled of mothballs and cedar, far too large for her slender frame, pinned at the waist to fit. She looked like a bird of prey dressed in the feathers of a crow. The heavy oak doors swung open, revealing a cavernous entrance hall that smelled of floor wax and desperation. Standing there, silhouetted against the dim candlelight, was the welcoming committee. The Viscount, George Vane, was a man who looked as though he were being slowly crushed by his own cravat. His face was a map of broken veins and bitterness. Beside him stood his wife, a woman with hair so tightly wound it seemed to pull her eyes into a permanent squint of suspicion. Behind them hovered 3 younger figures, 2 girls with the pale, pinched faces of those who had spent their lives being told they were better than everyone else, and a son who looked like he had already spent his inheritance on brandy and bad bets. "So," the Viscount said, his voice a dry rasp, "the prodigal niece returns, or what is left of her." He didn't move to embrace her. He didn't offer a word of condolence for the train crash that had supposedly nearly killed her. He merely looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her bruised temple and her cheap, borrowed clothes. "Oui, it is good to be remembered after 16 years of being abandoned," Marie said, her thick accent jarring the Viscount and his family like a stone thrown through a window. "Good heavens," the Viscountess whispered, her voice carrying across the hall like a lash. "The accent is bad enough, but her appearance—" "She looks like a kitchen wench." "French blood," the eldest daughter Clarissa giggled behind a lace handkerchief. "It's so dreadfully unwashed." Marie felt the familiar hot prickle of rage behind her eyes. She thought of Louise, gentle, soft Louise, who would have crumbled under these looks. Marie, however, simply allowed her gaze to travel slowly over the peeling wallpaper and the frayed edges of the hallway rug. "It is a pleasure to meet you as well," Marie said, her tone deliberate and sharp. "I see the hard times mentioned in your letter have left the house of Vane quite fatigue." "This house, uncle, it is crying. Do you not have the funds for a bucket of paint? Perhaps the allowance Uncle Etienne Gerard had been sending you for my maintenance, the allowance I never saw a cent of, was insufficient to cover your expenses." The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it might crack the floorboards. The Viscount's face turned a shade of purple that matched his waistcoat. Louise had long been aware of the money from her uncle and how it all ended up in the coffers of the Vanes. Louise had let it be, never mentioning it, but Marie would not. "Insolent girl," the Viscountess snapped. "You speak to your betters with the tongue of a wharf rat. We have brought you here out of the goodness of our hearts to save you from your own uncivilized origins." "Enough," George Vane barked, though his eyes remained on Marie with a murderous glint. "There are matters of business to attend to. The American solicitors are waiting in the study. We must settle the transition of your management." The study was a tomb of leather-bound books and stagnant air. 2 men in sombre black suits sat at a massive mahogany desk. One was an English solicitor, the other a sharp-eyed American named Mr. Miller, sent by the estate of the late Etienne Gerard. "Miss Louise Vane," Mr. Miller said, standing as Marie entered. He looked at her with professional curiosity, his brows slightly furrowing at her unkempt appearance and the bruises still visible on her face. "A tragic journey. I hope you recuperate soon enough." Marie nodded solemnly, taking the seat furthest from the Viscount. "Let us be brief," George Vane said, leaning over the desk. "My niece is young, foreign-bred, and clearly overwhelmed by the trauma of the accident. It is only logical that I, as the head of the House of Vane, be appointed as the sole executor of her inheritance. We have the papers drawn up." He pushed a stack of parchment toward Marie. "Sign here, Louise. It is for your own protection. You wouldn't know the first thing about managing a fortune of this magnitude." Marie didn't touch the pen. She looked at Mr. Miller. "And what did my Uncle Etienne say of this? Did he wish for his sweat and blood to be managed by men who forgot I existed until he died?" The English solicitor cleared his throat uncomfortably. He had sensed something was off when he arrived at the Vane Manor and was told Louise was in France, something Etienne Gerard had been unaware of for years. Etienne had stopped sending money 3 years ago after the Vanes constantly refused to send Louise to him, despite receiving letters from Louise saying she loved her life in London. "The will is specific, miss," Miller stated. "It states the inheritance is yours, but given the circumstances, a guardian is often suggested. However, Mr. Gerard did leave a final stipulation for identification. He was a paranoid man. He said the true heiress would carry a specific marker. The keepsake, the Viscount prompted, his eyes glittering with greed. The locket! Give it here, girl. Marie reached into her bodice and pulled out the tarnished silver locket with the lilies. The family let out a collective, hungry breath. To them, it looked like a cheap bauble next to gold and diamonds, but to Marie, it was the weight of a dead friend's soul. That's it, the Viscountess hissed. Give it to the solicitors. Marie held it up, but did not hand it over. The lawyer continued. Mr. Gerard told us that the locket has a secret, a spring that only a true Vane daughter would know. He also said you must answer a question. Marie nodded, clutching the silver tightly. Tell me, Miss Vane. Mr. Miller leaned forward. What was the name of the dog your mother kept at the summer cottage before you were sent to France? Marie didn't blink. Louise had shared every ghost of her memory in the dark of their attic. There was no dog, Marie said coolly. My mother used to be scared of them. She kept a cage of canaries in the conservatory because she liked to hear them sing. The Viscount stiffened. Mr. Miller nodded slowly. And the locket? Marie's thumbs found the 2 microscopic notches in the silver lilies, a trick Louise had shown her when they were 12. With a soft click, a hidden panel in the back slid away, revealing a tiny hand-painted miniature of a woman with dark hair, and behind it, a folded slip of bank-grade vellum. Marie handed the vellum to Mr. Miller. I am 22, old enough to handle my own affairs. I want no greasy hands on my money. I will act as executor for my own funds. What? The Viscount roared, slamming his fist on the desk. That is impossible. I am the Viscount. And you are broke, Marie countered, standing up. Mr. Miller, I wish to legally secure these funds in a private trust. I want no member of this family to have access to so much as a penny without my written, notarized consent. You little viper, the Viscountess screamed, after we took you in. Marie turned to her, a sharp, lethal smile on her lips. You took me in because you wanted to pick my pockets. Your English is perfect, Monsieur le Vicomte, Madame, but your manners, they are decidedly peasant-like. You treat a guest like a beggar, and now you wonder why the beggar has no coins for you. 2 weeks later, the uncivilized heiress was the talk of the ton. The House of Vane was forced to take her into society. To do otherwise would be to admit they had lost the war for the purse strings. The Duke of Ashworth's ball, the Viscountess muttered, as they stepped out of the carriage. Try not to embarrass us, Louise. Speak little. I shall do my best to remain as dull as an Englishwoman, Marie replied. The ballroom was a swirl of gold leaf and stifling heat. Marie felt the eyes on her immediately, the hungry gazes of lords who had started going to the Americas not to work, but to sell their titles to save their crumbling houses. To them, Louise was a dish ready for the picking. She escaped to the balcony, needing air. It's the smell of the rot, isn't it? A deep, masculine voice said from the shadows. Marie startled, her hand flying to the small dagger concealed in her garter. She trusted no one. A man stepped into the moonlight. He was tall, his shoulders broad enough to strain the seams of his exquisite evening coat. His hair was a dark, unruly mane, and his eyes held a dangerous, mocking glint. The ballroom, he said, moving closer. It smells of decaying ambition. You look like you're contemplating setting the curtains on fire. I'd recommend it. It's more spectacular. And who are you to offer such arsonist advice? Julian, he said with a mock bow. The Duke of Ashworth. A rakish disappointment to the crown. I run shipping lanes and gambling dens, which makes me marginally more honest than anyone in that room. He stepped into her personal space, the scent of expensive bourbon and cold night air clinging to him. He didn't look at her silks. He looked at her with a terrifying, predatory intensity. You're the Vane girl, he said. The one who told the Viscount his manners were peasant-like. It's been going around town. I like a woman who bites. I find that in England, honesty is a faux pas, Marie said, her voice breathier than she intended. The heat coming off him was a physical force. I am not a catastrophe, she added as he leaned closer. I am a reckoning, he finished for her, his voice a low vibration that seemed to hum right through her corset. Is that so? Well, Louise, I think I should like to watch you work. He leaned in further, his lips inches from the sensitive skin of her ear. The golden light from the ballroom caught the sharp line of his jaw. "But tell me one thing." His voice dropped to a gravelly whisper that sent a shiver straight down her spine. "Why does a girl with the wealthiest inheritance in London have the calloused hands of a girl who has spent years scrubbing stone?" Marie's heart nearly stopped. She tried to pull her hand away, but Julian was faster. He seized her wrist, his grip firm but strangely hot. He didn't just hold her, he turned her hand over, his thumb grazing slowly, deliberately over the rough patches of her palm. The contact was electric, a raw carnal friction that made her breath hitch. His thumb traced the line of her life, lingering on the scars of labour with a slow, agonizing pressure that felt more intimate than a kiss. "Don't look so frightened," he murmured, his eyes hooded and dark with a sudden sharp hunger as he looked from her hand to her trembling lips. "I like secrets. They're much more valuable than gold. And you, ma petite, are covered in them." He released her, his fingers trailing slowly down her arm before he stepped back into the shadows. "Enjoy the ball, little Vane. I have a feeling we're going to be seeing a lot of each other." Marie watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. He hadn't just met her, he had stripped her bare with a single touch. Chapter 3. The Price of a Name. The morning after the Ashworth ball, the Vane Manor felt less like a house and more like a pressure cooker. The air was thick with the scent of boiled cabbage and the metallic tang of hidden desperation. Marie sat in the morning room, her posture a defiant line of iron against the velvet chaise lounge. She pointedly ignored the tepid tea, steeped far too long like everything else in this house, and the heavy, suffocating silence of the Viscountess sitting across from her. The older woman was staring at Marie's hands. They were hidden beneath delicate silk gloves, yet the Viscountess peered at them as if she could see through to the fine fabric to the peasant skin beneath, searching for the ghosts of the flaws Marie had scrubbed in Paris. "You spent a great deal of time on the balcony with the Duke last night," the Viscountess finally said. Her voice was like the scraping of a dry leaf against a tombstone. "The air inside was stagnant," Marie replied, her eyes never leaving the pages of her book. "I find London society prefers to breathe each other's gossip rather than oxygen." "The Duke of Ashworth is a dangerous man, Louise. He is a rake, a gambler, and he associates with merchants. Men of trade." The Viscountess paused, a sickly sweet smile stretching her face, though her eyes remained as cold as flint. "But he is still a duke. If he is interested, it could be beneficial. However, a woman of your unique temperament requires a husband who understands the Vane blood, someone who can guide you, someone who knows the weight of our legacy." Marie finally looked up, her dark eyes flashing with a lethal wit. "By guide, you mean someone who can sign the checks you cannot reach. And by legacy, you mean the mounting debts the Viscount hides in his desk." The door swung open before the Viscountess could snap back. Arthur, the Viscount's son, sauntered in. He smelled of stale tobacco and the faint, sour note of morning brandy. At 25, he was undeniably handsome, in the way a poisonous flower is beautiful, blonde, slender, and fine-featured. He was the quintessential Vane, a mask of aristocratic perfection draped over a heart of pure greed. "Father wants us to go to the park," Arthur said, flashing a grin that didn't reach his bloodshot eyes. He looked Marie up and down, his gaze lingering on the swell of her chest with a proprietary air that made her skin crawl. "A promenade. Let the ton see the Vane heirs together. You look particularly glorious today, cousin. Truly, a jewel of the French streets." Marie felt the trap closing. They wanted her seen with Arthur to solidify the rumours of a cousin marriage. They had tried this 3 days ago at a local fair. Her cousins, Clarissa and Catherine, had conveniently claimed a sudden bout of the vapours, leaving Marie to be paraded around by Arthur as he whispered dull flatteries about her beauty, while his eyes calculated the value of her jewellery. "I have no desire to promenade," Marie said, standing up with a grace that made the silk of her dress hiss. "I have an appointment with Mr. Miller. We are discussing the permanent endowment of an orphanage." The Viscountess's teacup clattered against its saucer. "An orphanage? You would give Vane money to bastards and beggars." It is Gerard money, Marie corrected sharply, her voice ringing like a bell. And since you spent 16 years treating me like a beggar, I find I have a natural sympathy for them. She swept out of the room, leaving the air vibrating with their fury. But as she reached the hallway, a footman handed her a note. It was thick, cream-coloured vellum, sealed not with a crest, but with a smudge of black wax, dark and secretive. She tore it open. The handwriting was bold, slashing across the page. The shipping logs from the French coast are quite detailed, Miss Vane. They record 2 women boarding the train, but only one Louise being expected. I find myself wondering what happened to the fierce girl with the vivid blue eyes who wasn't mentioned in the letters. Meet me at the docks. Warehouse 14. Come alone, or I shall be forced to share my curiosity with the Home Office. J. Marie's blood turned to ice. Julian. He wasn't just flirting, he was hunting, and he had found the one thing she couldn't hide, her past. The London docks were a nightmare of fog, rotting wood, and the distant mournful screams of gulls. Warehouse 14 sat at the edge of the dark, oily water, its windows like the blind eyes of a corpse. Marie kept her hand on the hilt of the dagger tucked into her garter as she stepped into the cavernous space. The air smelled of salt, cedar, and the expensive tobacco Julian favoured. "You're late," Julian's voice echoed from the rafters. He was perched on a crate of imported tea, his evening finery replaced by a rougher wool coat and tall leather boots. He looked more like a pirate king than a peer of the realm. He jumped down, landing with the silent grace of a predator. He walked towards her, his presence overwhelming the small pool of amber light. "Blackmail is a very English way of requesting a meeting," Marie said, her voice steady despite the hammer thud of her heart. "It wasn't blackmail. It was an invitation to a game," Julian said, stopping only a foot away. "I've been looking into the accident, Marie. That was your name, wasn't it? The girl who worked at the Hotel de Ville. A very close friend of Miss Louise Vane. Similar features, but for the eyes. Yours are a vivid blue, while the Vane records mention a soft blue-grey." Marie didn't flinch. She felt an odd sense of relief that the lie was out, at least with him. Louise is dead. The Vanes killed her long before the train derailed. They killed her when they left her to rot in Lyon. They killed her when they stole the money Etienne Gerard sent for her care. I am simply the ghost she left behind to settle the bill. Time equal sign. 0.6s. Julian studied her face, his expression unreadable. Then he noticed the shimmer in her eyes. "And you? Did you kill her to take her place?" "I loved her." Marie's voice cracked, the grief she had been burying finally surfacing. Fat, heavy tears fell, though her face remained still and fierce. "She was my sister in every way that mattered. I am here to do what she was too gentle to do. I am here to break them." Julian reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, his thumb catching a stray tear. The touch was unexpectedly tender, a stark contrast to his usual mockery. "The Viscount is planning to compromise you, Marie. A scandalous discovery in a garden, a forced marriage to Arthur. They won't let that fortune walk away. They are at a breaking point." "Let them try," Marie hissed. "I have a better idea," Julian said, a wolfish glint in his eyes. "The Vanes owe me a significant gambling debt. If I demand it now, they lose the house. But if I marry the heiress, the debt is settled. I don't need your money, Marie. I want the woman who has enough fire to burn London down. Become my Duchess. It gives you a title they can't touch and a protection they can't break." "And what do you get, Julian?" "Entertainment," he smiled, his lips twitching. "I tire of dodging mothers and their daughters. Do you know how many uninvited naked women I've found in my bed just this season?" Marie shrugged, a small smirk playing on her lips. "Perhaps they simply heard you were accommodating." Julian stepped closer, the heat of his body radiating through her silk dress. "And perhaps," he whispered, "I want someone who isn't afraid to hold my hand with calloused palms." The air between them changed, becoming thick and electric. Julian didn't wait for an answer. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, pulling her into him. When his lips met hers, it wasn't a gentle proposal. It was a collision. The kiss was fueled by the adrenaline of the docks, the danger of her secret, and the raw shared hunger of 2 outsiders who had finally found their match. Marie wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer as she met his tongue with her own. Julian groaned a low, primal sound as he backed her against a crate of silk. His hands were everywhere, tracing the curve of her waist, pulling her hips flush against his. The world outside, the veins, the fortune, the lies, vanished. There was only the scent of him, the taste of salt and bourbon, and the frantic beat of two hearts in sync. The kiss escalated, Julian's hands finding the laces of her bodice with the practiced ease of a man who knew his way around a woman's clothes. Marie didn't stop him. She wanted this. She wanted to feel something other than rage and grief. In the shadows of the warehouse, amidst the scent of cedar and sea air, they shed their masks and their clothes. It was a night of erotic passion, a desperate, beautiful tangle of limbs and gasps. Julian was a masterful lover, his touch both demanding and worshipful, finding the places that made Marie cry out his name. And Marie, free from the constraints of Louise, gave as good as she got, her movements fierce and uninhibited. There had been a few lovers in France, but none of them were as good as Julian. Later, as they lay tangled together in the dim light on the floor of a warehouse on silk, Marie felt a peace she hadn't known in years, but the silence was short-lived. A crash echoed from the front of the warehouse. "Louise!" a voice shouted. It was Arthur. He burst into the pool of light, backed by two hired thugs. He looked frantic, his cravat undone, his eyes wide with a manic desperation. "We followed you. Meeting a man in a warehouse? How scandalous. I think a wedding is the only way to save your reputation now, cousin." Marie scrambled for her shift, her eyes flashing like a cat's in the dark. Julian, however, didn't seem bothered. He stood slowly, unabashedly naked for a moment, before pulling on his trousers, his movements calm and deadly. He stepped in front of Marie, his eyes turning cold and lethal. Arthur paled as the light hit Julian's face, realizing exactly who he had followed. "Arthur," Julian said softly, the sound more terrifying than a shout. "You've made a very poor choice of warehouses and a very poor choice of women." Arthur stumbled back, his bravado vanishing instantly. "Ashworth, I didn't realize." "Get out!" Julian commanded, his voice like the crack of a whip. "And if I hear so much as a whisper of this night, I won't just collect your father's debt. I'll collect your head." As Arthur and his thugs fled into the fog, Julian turned back to Marie. He reached out, helping her to her feet, his touch lingering on her skin. "Well," he said, a crooked smile returning to his face, "I suppose that settles the engagement." Marie looked at him, her heart still racing from the passion and the near discovery. She took his hand, her calloused palm against his, and nodded. To the reckoning, then. Chapter 4. The Fraud. The sun had barely begun to burn through the stubborn London fog when Julian, the Duke of Ashworth, made his first move of the season. He did not send flowers. He sent a black stallion, a beast of such raw power and pedigree that the grooms at the Vane stables trembled as they took the reins. The note attached was simple: "For the lady who prefers to ride the storm." For the next 2 weeks, London became a theatre for their mutual obsession, their public displays bordering on scandalous. Julian, a man who usually treated the Tarn with the bored indifference of a god among insects, was suddenly everywhere Louise Vane was. He was at the opera, standing in the back of her box, his hand resting casually, scandalously, on the velvet just above her shoulder. He was at the Botanical Gardens, leaning in so close to her that their breaths mingled, his eyes never leaving her face as she spoke in her sharp, rhythmic French. To the Tarn, it was a terrifying alignment of power. Marie was the wealthiest woman in the city. Julian was the man to whom half the city owed money. Together they were untouchable. In private, however, the courtship was far more visceral. Behind the heavy oak doors of Julian's study, between his sheets, or within the draped shadows of his private carriage, the air was perpetually charged with a carnal electricity. Their attraction was a physical weight, a hunger that seemed to grow the more it was fed. "You are playing a dangerous game, mon duc," Marie whispered one midnight. Her back was pressed against the cold stone of a fireplace in his townhouse, her face flushed from being taken thoroughly against the wall. Julian's hands were under the bunched silk of her skirts, his trousers low and his member still connected to Marie in a primitive, pulse-pounding sense. He intended to take her again in a few minutes once he caught his breath. "I've always preferred games where the stakes are life or death," Julian murmured, his lips finding the sensitive pulse point at her throat. He pulled her closer, his strength an anchor. "The Ton is terrified of you. They see the gold, and they see me. And they realize they are looking at their masters." He turned her hand over, kissing the calloused palm he had discovered at the warehouse. He didn't hide from the roughness of her skin. He worshipped it. Each touch was an erotic acknowledgement of her truth. In those moments, she wasn't Louise Vane, the heiress. She was Marie, the girl who had fought her way out of the gutter, and Julian was the only man who could handle the fire she carried. By day, Marie used her newfound social invincibility as a scalpel. At the Lady Danbury garden party, the Viscountess Vane and her daughters, Clarissa and Catherine, followed Marie like desperate, overdressed shadows. When Marie felt generous, she would release small funds for them, and their greedy eyes would grow large, hungering for more. Clarissa and Catherine were parched for attention, but the young lords of London had eyes only for the French firebrand. "Uncle George," Marie said, her voice carrying across the dinner table one evening. The Viscount turned, his face pale. "I received the bill for the stable repairs. It seems you've overspent your personal allowance again. Are you having trouble with your mathematics, or do you simply find it difficult to live within your means?" The table went silent. The Viscountess flushed a deep, ugly red. "Louise, really?" the Viscountess hissed. "This is hardly the place." "I disagree," Marie said, taking a sip of champagne and looking directly at a group of creditors standing nearby. "I believe in transparency. If my dear uncle requires a small loan to keep the roof from collapsing, he should ask for it properly. Go on, uncle. Ask. Perhaps if you say please in front of everyone, I shall find the heart to increase your stipend." The Viscount, humiliated and desperate, was forced to mutter a plea for funds in front of his family. Marie watched him with a cold, glittering satisfaction. She was making them beg for crumbs of the fortune they had tried to steal. Cold murder was in George's eyes, but all Marie had to do was remind herself of the new evidence she had uncovered. Her parents had left her a generous trust which George was supposed to manage, and a cosy townhouse too, but all of it had been stolen. Not a cent was spent on Louise. This dominance sparked a bitter jealousy in Clarissa and Catherine. They watched from the sidelines as suitor after suitor approached Marie, ignored by the very men they had hoped would propose to them. "She is a savage," Clarissa whispered to her sister. "Look at her hands, Catherine. I saw her reach for a glass without her gloves earlier. They are the hands of a peasant. She is simply uncouth." They would say this in front of their peers, hoping to poison her reputation. A young lady, Miss Annabel Crowley, asked, "I noticed her hands too. How are they so roughed? I thought your parents sent her to an elite boarding school in France." Clarissa blanched, knowing she had overspoken. The narrative they were trying to paint was of Louise being a spoilt brat, not an orphan, not someone sent to a boarding school that doubled as an asylum for the forgotten. What Clarissa and Catherine didn't know was that the damage was already done. The whispers of how Louise was poorly treated by the Vanes were already beginning to make the rounds. Arthur, watching Marie from across the lawn, felt the sting of his father's humiliation most. He was still convinced that if he could only tame her, the money would return to him. One evening after a particularly heavy bout of drinking, he cornered her in the Vane library. "You think you're so clever," Arthur sneered, stumbling toward her. He tried to grab her waist, his breath reeking of gin. "You think the Duke will marry a girl who speaks like a streetwalker? You need a Vane, Louise. You need someone who knows what you really are. I'm willing to marry you, though you have soiled yourself and spread your legs for that scoundrel." Marie didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. As Arthur lunged to kiss her, she stepped aside with the grace of a matador and drove her elbow into his ribs, followed by a swift, brutal kick to the back of his knee. As he collapsed, gasping, she leaned over him, her face inches from his. His eyes went wide as he looked into her clear, angry blue eyes. "If you touch me again, Arthur," she whispered in French, her voice a low, lethal vibration, "I will ensure the Duke collects your and your father's gambling debts. Tonight, you will be sleeping in the street by dawn. Do you understand?" Arthur scrambled away, but that night, as he sat with his parents, a seed of doubt finally sprouted. "Her eyes," Arthur muttered, nursing his bruised ribs. "I remember when she stayed with us for that week before she was sent away. 6 years old. She was a docile, quiet, moping thing with silvery blue eyes, like the fog. But this woman, her eyes are a vivid, striking blue, and they hold so much anger, not solemnity, anger. Eyes don't change that much as you age, do they?" The Viscount and his wife exchanged a sharp, sudden look. The antennae of their greed were finally twitching. A nibbling doubt had been eating at them too. This viper wouldn't have let them steal her extremely generous allowance all these years. It was as if a different person was in Louise's place. The Viscountess added, her voice a low hiss. "The accent is far too thick for a girl born in England. George, we must look into this." They began a frantic, secret investigation. They sent inquiries to the school in Lyon, to neighbours in Paris, to anyone who might have known the real Louise. But everywhere they looked, they found a dead end. Julian had been thorough. He had dispatched his own agents to buy silences and alter records. The headmistress had received a donation that ensured her memory of Louise Vane matched Marie's description perfectly. There was no mention that Louise had a friend called Marie. The train station records now showed Miss Louise Vane boarded the train alone. Marie, sensing their suspicion, decided to feed it. She began to deliberately leave clues. A scrap of a letter written in Marie's real handwriting, a mention of a place in Paris Louise had never been. She wanted them to feel the noose tightening. The Vanes, finding no real evidence, grew desperate. They began to fabricate their own. They whispered to the Ton about her oddities, claiming the real Louise had grown up in luxury, not this rough girl who knew hard labour. "They are biting at the lure," Marie told Julian one night in the quiet of his library. She was sitting on his desk, her legs draped over his lap. "Let them bite," Julian said, his hands tracing the curve of her calf. "The trap is set. I've planted the final discrepancy." The discrepancy was a masterpiece of forgery. It was a lost school record, conveniently discovered, suggesting that the real Louise Vane had died of a fever at age 10. A person claiming to be the assistant of the principal at her old school contacted the Viscount with the information. A week later, the Viscount burst into the morning room where Marie was having breakfast. He was brandishing the forged paper, his face triumphant. "Fraud," he screamed. "You are a common thief. This record proves Louise Vane died years ago. You are a fake. You will hang for this. The inheritance belongs to me." Marie didn't look up from her toast. "Is that so, Uncle? A record found out of the blue? How very convenient." "The courts will decide," the Viscountess shrieked from the doorway. "We have already contacted the magistrate. You and your Duke will both fall for this. I know that scoundrel helped you in this forgery." But Marie and Julian had already orchestrated the masterstroke. Using the Vanes' own desperation, Julian had leaked a tip to the Viscount that if he invested heavily in a certain shipping venture, he could multiply his current funds tenfold before the trial even began. The Viscount, blinded by greed, had liquidated every remaining Vane asset and even borrowed against the manor itself to invest in Julian's phantom company. The climax came in the grand foyer of the Vane Manor in front of the magistrate. George wanted a spectacle and had invited half the Ton, whom Julian had lured there under the guise of an engagement announcement. "Arrest her," the Viscount demanded, pointing at Marie. "On what grounds, George?" Julian asked, stepping forward. "I have evidence that this woman here is a fraud. My poor niece Louise died when she was 10, George shouted proudly. "What are you talking about, my lord?" Mr. Miller, the American solicitor, stepped forward, looking appalled. How could Louise have died? Her uncle Etienne Gerard had been receiving letters from her every month until he died. "Letters on your family's headed paper. Mr. Gerard has been sending funds to you for his niece for 15 years. Explain yourself." George blanched, then straightened. "What you say is irrelevant, Mr. Miller. The issue is that this woman is a fake. I have the evidence." He handed the forged record to the magistrate. "I just received the news. How perfect that you are here today, magistrate." "The record you hold is a forgery," Julian said, his voice ringing with authority. "And we have the man who created it for you in custody. But more importantly, Mr. Magistrate, I believe you should look at these financial records." Julian revealed the paper trail of the shipping venture. It showed that the Viscount had illegally attempted to use Marie's trust and had committed massive financial fraud. Upon closer inspection, the document George held was proved to be a terrible forgery. It was written in English and dated February 31st. George staggered back. "She is a fake, her eyes. Tell them, Arthur. Tell them about her eyes." Attention turned to Arthur, who shook his head, realizing the eyes argument was weak. Constables were called and George was taken into custody. "You've been swindled by your own greed, George," Marie said, standing by the side of the constable's vehicle as the party guests dispersed. "There is no shipping company. You've leveraged this house to pay for a lie. You are done." Louise is looking down with satisfaction from heaven now. George's eyes grew wide. "You?" Marie clicked her tongue. Now, George, you had this coming. If you have any decency left, you will pay for your crimes. Maybe your daughters will have a chance to marry decent men. I might even settle a small allowance on them. They are innocent, after all. Cause more trouble, and they will not even have that. George deflated, realizing no one would believe him. The Vanes were ruined. George and his wife went to debtor's prison. Justice was cold, but for Marie, it tasted like victory. A month later, Arthur and his sisters were cast out, forced to live in a cramped apartment, a mirror of the poverty they had forced Louise into. A small allowance was settled on them just to cover basic necessities, a charity Marie offered because she knew Louise would have wanted it. Marie stood in the now empty ballroom of the Vane Manor, her hand in Julian's. "It's over," she whispered. "No," Julian said, pulling her into his arms, his gaze intense. "It is only the beginning. The world knows you as Louise, but I know you as Marie. And I think the Duchess of Ashworth should be a woman who knows exactly how to handle a revolution." He kissed her then, a deep, passionate promise. Marie had corrected an injustice. She had taken a name that wasn't hers to protect a friend, and in the end, she had claimed a life that was entirely her own. She did not steal a life. She corrected an injustice and claimed her own. The end. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the story, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next one.